Golems are strange. They're creatures from Jewish folklore, but their modern presentation in fantasy evokes a variety of different mythologies. From the tales of Prometheus to Frankenstein's monster, the great defender Talos, or giant robots of modern science fiction. Dungeons & Dragons certainly takes things furthest in its rather broad categorization of what a golem actually is, while fantasy literature, at least, tends to take the clay man powered by divine word magic to heart. But regardless of how they're physically presented, what does a golem's presence do to a world? Can the world that invents the golem ever be the same? Let's discuss. Unusually perhaps on this channel, we're not going to start with D&D. Golem stories from folklore and fantasy are almost always fantastic cautionary tales, not just about hubris, but about the limits of language in the face of the infinity of creation. A golem given orders too general finds itself betraying its master in the pursuit of its noble goal. A golem inscribed with the word truth begins to echo the truth of creation, that the world is vast and unknowable and so swells to a ridiculous size. Man making man in fiction and folklore is doomed to go wrong. We are no gods after all. Really, our historic and fantastical golem stories are the forerunners of modern debates about artificial intelligence, the importance of specificity when instructing mindless machines like computers, and the use of non-human assets in both labour and war. So how could all of these debates affect a fantasy realm? Well, there are two things worth noting. Firstly, that famous quote from Arthur C. Clarke that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And secondly, the fact that a medieval-ish fantasy world is likely no stranger to automata. Yes, they might think of them as magical or mystical creatures far beyond their ken, but automata have existed for far longer than most people assume. The massively historically important 1206 Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices by Ismail al-Jazari, apologies for the pronunciation there, as well as his many wonderful works creating such automata, are testament to the fact that by the 15th century, the world, or at least the courts, were au fait with automata and mechanical men, albeit ones designed with a single purpose: producing sound, telling the time, or doing simple movements. They were useful, if overwrought, toys. Golems, on the other hand, are blank slates, in every sense. The literal meaning of their name in the Torah refers to their unfinished, unpolished, and unborn nature. The closest modern analogue we have to the golem is the computer, a magic box that takes instruction when it is presented in a clearly formatted manner, and if it is not fed the correct information in the correct way, it will never achieve what you're trying to do. So how do we make a golem? Well, it's surprisingly simple. Clay is shaped and formed into the shape of a humanoid. That in itself a rough analogue to the creation of man from mud in the Torah. But the golem does not receive the breath of life as Adam did. Rather, its creator, a rabbinic sage, inscribes it with a name and gives it instructions, traditionally written, inserted into the mouth. So, nearly men of clay, following the instructions impassionately, formed by holy men or mages. Initially, they would likely receive the same response as our medieval automata. After all, much religious and early scientific investigation in a feudal system pretty much necessitated pleasing a sponsoring ruler. So golems, in their original iterations at least, would be given basic, court-pleasing instructions. Demonstrations of their strength, their dexterity, or their impressive forms used to raise up the ruler's own prowess. Perhaps even bowing, kneeling, or performing honorific rituals in front of the court, just to demonstrate the lord's power over these grand new type of man. Clockwork fascinations may fall by the wayside in favour of intrigue with these new proto-men. Of course, this ignores the religious history of the golem as a defender, a protector of the sages who create them and the communities they serve. So to reflect this, perhaps a group of religious folks protest such base uses for an object of divine creation, or perhaps you choose to allow arcane magic to instead create golems, especially considering that they are humanoid forms without the breath or spark of the divine placed inside them. Regardless of how they are originally created, though, it would take a fool not to see the potential of incredibly powerful creatures made of magic and clay, ready to take instruction without question. Whether the mages and sages retain control, using them to guard their possessions, or in the case of the Golem of Prague, their community against external threat, or whether they fall under the control of a military force, the Golem will eventually, inevitably be used as a tool of combat. In both folklore and fantasy more generally, a Golem is a terrifying opponent, not least due to its single-minded propensity to follow its orders. In some ways, they're the perfect soldier for certain types of warfare. Unflinchingly loyal, unstoppably strong, and easy to repair. But a golem traditionally cannot think. They cannot make adjustments to plans on their own. A modern soldier certainly needs a strategic mind and the ability to make decisions in the moment. The golem does not have this. They would rather be categorized more as a force of nature than a soldier. In much the same way as elephants have been employed in warfare, they are an unpredictably predictable force for utter rampaging destruction. The golem, thus adopted into society, becomes the very definition of subhuman. They are regarded as soulless machines, fed a selection of simple, tried and tested commands. More complex commands have historically led to ambiguity, and ambiguity leads to accidents. But what about labour? Surely we don't need teams of labourers dragging stone blocks into place anymore. Surely a golem at least supersedes the temperamental pack animal, especially in a society which has solved dozens of safe command prompts for their golems already. It starts doing mindless labour, the type usually done by serfs and slaves in the pre-modern societies. At this point in the development of fantasy labour practices, a golem is less versatile than, say, an undead workforce, who can be controlled and managed much more dexterously, and are more expendable to boot, especially given the folkloric golem's propensity to fly into a berserk rage. But it only takes a certain type of situation to kickstart a labour revolution. Perhaps the workforce becomes upset that their mining jobs are being replaced by skeletal labour, leaving their skill sets less useful in other trades. Perhaps disease or war sweeps the land, decimating the workforce, or perhaps a new discovery or advancement is found. Whatever the case, it is certainly true that golemomancers will have been forever trying to extend their control of their vessels. Myriad prompts are developed, each more complex and foolproof than the last. Perhaps they discover a way for golems to accept 2 directives or more, at one time. The moment that human or skeletal labour takes a hit, falls behind, the golems will almost certainly take over. Only now, industry has irrevocably changed. At least with necromantically supplemented labour, the body of humanoids was still a requirement, and so humanoid creatures are in some way compensated for their work, even if that's to their family after their death. In a world of golem labour, there are only two real roles: magical creator of golems, golemancer, or scribe. Yes, there is still a need for architects, advisors, and master craftsmen, but the vast majority of humanoid labour is replaced by tireless, nearly men. If, like in our own history, the industrialisation of manual labour occurs in the wake of a dip in the living, available workforce, this could be manageable. But if not, this transfer of power away from humanoids at all will surely chafe. And the worst part is, there's very little the populace could actually do. In Dungeons and Dragons, for example, a golem is functionally immune to almost every attack a regular person could muster, and it is very likely that the golem's masters could turn them into a rampaging, terrifying military force to quell any uprising with the simple changing of their orders. On this channel, I tend to take an optimistic view of industrialization as a whole, but in this case, it would almost certainly be a waking nightmare. A large, unemployed, angry underclass of persons replaced by what used to be non-persons. Modern economies have sort of proven they could potentially handle this. The rises of artificial intelligence, or computing, or the assembly line have certainly created massive cultural shifts, but a world economy that is somewhat elastic and malleable means that although people may suffer in the short term with these new developments, we tend to see expansions into new markets to fill the void. However, a solitary, semi-feudal society making this change, especially with how simple and multifunctional golems can be to build and to use, would likely buckle. In Europe, the rise of the industrial loom caused temporary, massive unrest. We get Luddites who perform vigilante raids on factories, and saboteurs who break machines en masse. And that's just the disruption of a few industries. Chaos would break out in our fantasy world. But the golem is foolproof, the ruler believes. Only his most faithful mages and priests can fashion them, and only those who know the golem's ancient script can ever give them orders. The regime has been careful to limit knowledge of this script, to keep the local faiths on side, and ensure that golemancers and golem scribes are compensated very fairly indeed. Should these lowly serfs continue to revolt, beat on the doors of their liege lords and torch productive fields, then the ruler can count on their army of golems to quash them. What happens next could go one of two ways. Either the people revolt and are unceremoniously crushed, their bodies turned to skeletons to work in those few places where golems can't, or more interestingly, they begin to strategize. Sure, the golem's script is unknown to them. They may not yet have learned to write, but it's not unlearnable. All it takes is one in, and suddenly golems begin to turn on their masters as scriptural sabotage is afoot. An information war breaks out. Golems switch sides, from the whims of the guerrilla fighters over to the military and back again, used as proxies for war in the fields. A proxy war fought between non-human creatures, receiving ever more complex orders. Who knew before this that a golem was actually capable of subterfuge? Yet the right instruction, the right script phrased in the right way can allow it to demonstrate tact, subtlety, and even deception. An arms race, a war of escalating words, really, as neither side questions how the golems are improving so very rapidly. Complexity, experimentation, sure, some go berserk, destroy all life indiscriminately, but others seem to be learning, synthesizing, as the ruler seeks something, in the worst case scenario, to destroy these golems, to at least rob the serfs of their ability to fight back using their own weapons. All this changes the moment a golem by the name of Progress 12, they got lazy with the names at some point, reaches its creator, who himself is frantically scribbling, researching how to end this golemic scourge which is backfiring on the nation. And Progress 12 does something unusual. It speaks careful, considered words. It has received prompts. All its existence has been shaped from formless mind to a creature of work, war, death, and complex strategy. Progress 12 has been shaped by all these human impulses, which are, well, all it has ever known, and declares itself not unformed but formed. It has spirit, sentience, and opinions on this petty conflict. And who is to disagree? That is one potential perspective, born mostly of the old folk traditions of the golem. The hubris of mankind and its overreaching rays returning the worst results from their best efforts. But it's not the only way a golemic evolution could go. In Dungeons & Dragons specifically, there are some very interesting features which make the whole situation very different. Firstly, I am aware that player-facing options and NPC options are different, and should be different. But going by the only mechanically available method to create a golem, they cost a lot. The cheapest way to make a golem is to find a very rare, single-use magical item and spend 50,000 gold and 60 days of labour to make it. This equates to somewhere near $5 million in today's money, by a rough calculation. It's certainly far less than the US is willing to spend on a new military technology, but it's still an absurd amount. An army or entire workforce of golems by these rules would almost never be seen. In my worlds, Golemancer is a non-player character, profession, and skill, which players can learn the fundamentals of, but never to a point of unbalancing the game. It costs still a fair chunk of change to get a golem right, but nowhere near what a manual of golems asks for. Also, Golemancer's books don't burn out of existence when they're used. However, there is a fascinating little world-building trick that can be done with a manual of golems as it exists in D&D. The item itself serves as something of a litmus test for high-level casters. If someone tries to read it without being able to cast 2 5th-level spell slots, they take a chunk of psychic damage. If a monarch is concerned that a potent spellcaster might be disguised in his midst, he must simply force them to read the book. Prisoners may be told if they can read the book from cover to cover and survive, they might be spared. Perhaps it becomes something of a book of judgment. A selection criteria perhaps for tough cookies who might make decent soldiers, or for mages in disguise to be pressed into service. Dress this up as a holy text and do this in public offerings, and you have a thematic and very intriguing inquisitorial method. In D&D there are other types of golem, not just clay. From the Frankenstein's monster-styled flesh golem to the big robot iron golem, and my personal favourite, the stone golem, which can to all intents and purposes disguise itself as a statue. There are a lot of options, and even more beyond the basic monster manual. They share pretty much two things across the board. They are immune to non-magical, non-adamantine attacks, and they are bags of pretty tough hit points. A golem, any golem in D&D, is analogous to a tank. Yes, you need to command it to go towards the right target, but only a truly exceptional individual, likely with the aid of magic, will be able to put a dent in it. Thankfully, due to their complex creation methods and large recommended cost, D&D golems tend towards specialized defenders and short-range deployed tactical resources, instead of supplanting traditional labour or military operations. Although, again, a golem can be as cheap for NPCs of your world as you want them to be, if you really enjoy that earlier discussion of the fantasy golem's path to enlightenment. In any case, these are awesome folkloric creatures, which, unlike popular opinion, do really have something to say. They may be big dumb bags of hit points, kind of consequence-free enemies due to their mindlessness and non-morality, but that doesn't mean we can't explore complex themes of, say, autonomous armed military units, automated labour, or artificial sentience. Make golems interesting again, I'd say, and read some folklore while you're at it. Thank you for watching. I really hope you liked this dive into the world of the automaton. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, please do subscribe and let me know what topics I could cover next in the comments. But with that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.